And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. It is Wednesday, May 15th, 2024, and this outlook is for Thursday and Friday here as we head toward the weekend. And looking at the sea ice starting on this Wednesday afternoon, it continues to melt off here in the central and northern Bering with a lot of large openings, polynyas. However, it's a slow process because temperatures in this region have averaged below normal. Now, we've had a strong frontal system push in through here, creating southeast to south winds that have been quite strong and shifted the ice around. So we'll just continue to see a gradual melt off despite some below normal temperatures lingering in this region of the state that we anticipate and now up through the end of the month. Looking at the weather map late tonight, early on Thursday morning, fronts initially pushed in. There's a secondary trough along the coast. The main low lifting north there, just northeast of Wrangel Island. Got a little ridge building into the Gulf, so that'll bring some quieter weather. The secondary low development, not very strong, but it is going to force a low across the Gulf as we go through Thursday evening and into Friday, and the system will have with it some areas of light rain and rain showers. Back to the west, though, coming in off the Asian mainland is another low along the Kamchatka coast. This low is going to head southeastward and eventually cross the Alaska Peninsula on Saturday morning. So in the meantime, by Friday afternoon, we find that low out in the central Bering heading southeastward, and areas of the lower Yukon coast, including St. Lawrence Island, Nunavik Island, Bristol Bay coastline could get brushed by this system with some breezy conditions and some light precipitation. Here's that weak area of low pressure crossing the Gulf, a trough here across the mainland with some scattered showers popping up with the daytime heating, especially afternoon and evening hours there across the central, east central interior. So the marine forecast for Thursday calls for north-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, inner channel waves 2 to 3 feet. The outer coast, look for west-northwest winds as high as 20-25 knots south of Gustavus off at Sitka and Craig. Westerly 15-knot winds there, Yakutat Bay back toward Cape Suckling. And then for Friday, the inner channels will see winds south-southwest there from Petersburg up through Juneau, but northwesterly 10 knots. And waves within the inner channels, generally a foot or two. The outer coast, look for southwest to west winds 10 to 15 knots. Sitka down to off of Craig with swells 5 feet. Variable winds 5 to 10 knots. West of Gustavus on up toward southeast winds 10 knots there at Cape Suckling. Now, variable winds around 10 knots will be outside of Hinchinbrook entrance as well as within Prince William Sound and off the Kenai coast, only around 10 knots. Winds, though, will be out of the southeast to 20 knots there at the entrance of Cook Inlet with 4 or 5 foot swells. And then on Friday, variable winds continue here within Prince William Sound with a couple of foot waves and outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. But look for winds that are set northeasterly along the Kenai coast, 15 knots. Westerly at the entrance of Cook Inlet, 15 knots there, and then southwest winds 10 knots, anchor point on up toward Upper Cook Inlet. Winds will be south-southeast 15 to 20 knots around Kodiak Island on Thursday. Generally, westerly winds around 15 knots across the Alaska Peninsula. Swells 3 to 4 feet on the North Pacific side, 4 to as high as 8 feet north of Cold Bay on the Bering side. And then for Friday, look for west-northwest winds 20 knots around Kodiak Island. Back through the central Alaska Peninsula, winds become variable at 10 knots and then turn back toward the south-southwest, 15 to 20 knots there, False Paths and Cold Bay. The Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, westerly winds 15 to 20 knots, becoming variable at 10 knots, Atka, Adak to Kiska, and then back to the south-southwest, 15 to 20 knots west of Kiska to Shimia. And across the eastern and central Aleutians, look for west-southwest winds, generally in the 15 to 20 knot range, more variable winds around 10 knots west of Adak. Along the southwest coast, 15-knot winds, southwest winds into Bristol Bay, southwest winds to 10 knots into Kuskokwim Bay, westerly winds 15 knots around the Pribilof Islands with 8-9 foot swells. Along the outer Yukon coast, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, southerly winds within the area of Norton Sound with areas where there is some open water, swells 3-4 feet. And then on Friday, as that next low drop southeastward across the central Bering. It's going to turn winds to the south-southeast. We'll find winds out of the southwest 15 knots into Bristol Bay, southerly winds 50 knots into Kuskokwim Bay, and then south winds 20 to 25 knots, Pribilovs up to St. Matthew, and then along the lower Yukon coast, we're looking at 20 to 25 knot southeasterly winds and southeast winds to 15 knots there within Norton Sound. For Thursday, winds will still be brisk, but not as strong as what they have been on Tuesday and Wednesday. We expect southerly winds through the Bering Strait around 25 knots up through the lower Chukchi Sea. Strongest off of Point Hope and Cape Lisburn could have 35 knot southerly gales, and then they come back down to 25 knot southerly winds all the way to Utqiagvik. And look for winds turning easterly at 15 knots over at Kaktovik in the far eastern area of the Arctic coast. And then for Friday, winds along the Arctic coast from Kaktovik to Utqiagvik will generally be east to southeast 5 to 10 knots. And then as we drop down through the lower Chukchi Sea, southerly winds continue around 15 to 20 knots north of the Bering Strait. But once we get down south of the Bering Strait, the west side of the Seward Peninsula, including Wales, Port Clarence on over to St. Lawrence Island, winds will be out of the southeast at 20 knots.